The freezing desert wind did not howl. It shrieked like a dying animal through the narrow, twisting walls of the canyon. Esther Mercer dragged her feet through the loose red sand, her breath pluming into the frigid night air in ragged, broken gasps. The thin soles of her leather boots had worn through 3 miles ago, leaving her torn stockings to absorb the punishing bite of jagged rocks and freezing dust. Her faded blue frontier dress, once a symbol of her proud position as the town's schoolteacher, was now heavily stained with mud and snagged by sharp desert brush. She wrapped a threadbare knitted shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders, her left hand instinctively moving down to shield the slight, undeniable swell of her abdomen. Every step felt like walking through broken glass. The temperature in the canyon dropped dangerously fast after sundown, replacing the blistering daytime heat with a bone-chilling frost that seeped deep into the marrow. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, tasting of iron and alkali dust. She squeezed her wide, pale blue eyes shut for a fraction of a second, fighting off the black spots dancing in her peripheral vision. She could not stop. If she stopped, she would freeze. And if she froze, the child growing inside her would die before ever drawing a breath. Her mind, desperate to escape the agonizing physical pain, violently pulled her back to the horrors of the previous morning. The sun had been high and bright over the dusty schoolyard. Mayor Hiram Croft had stood on the wooden steps of the schoolhouse, his perfectly tailored suit, a stark contrast to the ugly, venomous sneer on his face. The entire town had gathered, their eyes filled with vicious judgment, as Croft pointed a thick finger at her. "A woman of your condition has no place teaching our innocent children." Croft had boomed, his voice echoing off the clapboard buildings. Esther had stood there paralyzed by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the man. It was Croft who had cornered her in the schoolhouse a month prior, using his absolute authority over her employment and livelihood to force himself upon her. Now, with the undeniable proof of his sin taking root in her body, he was discarding her like soiled rags to protect his pristine political reputation. "You are a disgrace, Miss Mercer. I want you out of this town by sunset. If I see your face within the county lines tomorrow, the sheriff will arrest you for vagrancy." She had begged for a wagon, for a horse, for anything to help her cross the treacherous desert divide. The townspeople had simply turned their backs, shutting their doors. In her sheer desperation, she had run to the livery stable, finding the solitary Mescalero Apache wagon driver who passed through town once a month. Delshay. He was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, a widower who tolerated the white settlements only enough to earn coin. She had offered him her only valuable possession, a silver locket containing her mother's picture, if he would just take her out of the valley. Delshay had looked at her swollen belly, then at the mob gathering near the saloon, his dark, observant eyes reading the lethal undercurrents of the town. A pregnant woman hunted by the mayor brings death to whoever drives her. Delshay had said, his voice flat and uncompromising. He had refused her the ride, packed his horses, and left her standing in the dust. Now, shivering violently in the pitch-black canyon, Esther coughed a harsh, rattling sound that tore at her dry throat. The trail was narrowing. The sheer sandstone walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, blocking out the starlight. She stumbled over a massive, half-buried root, her knees slamming brutally into the frozen earth. A sharp cry escaped her bleeding lips. The pain was blinding. She tried to push herself up, her frozen fingers desperately clawing at the dirt, but her arms simply gave out. The sheer exhaustion of the forced march, the lack of food, and the punishing cold finally broke her fragile endurance. She collapsed against a pile of broken adobe bricks as the icy grip of unconsciousness began to pull her under. Her eyes fluttered open. Through the swirling desert frost tucked deep beneath the overhanging cliff, she saw the ruined archway of an old Spanish mission. And beyond the crumbling clay walls, a faint, flickering golden glow. Fire. Adrenaline pure and primitive surged through her fading veins. Esther dragged herself forward on her hands and knees. The rough sand tore through the torn hem of her skirt, skinning her shins, but she didn't care. She crawled toward the broken doorway of the ruins, her vision tunneling until nothing existed but the warmth radiating from the courtyard. She reached the threshold, pulling herself up by clinging to the crumbling adobe frame. The heavy desert wind whipped her tangled auburn hair across her hollowed cheeks. Inside, sheltered from the gale, a small, smokeless fire crackled. Sitting beside it, calmly wiping the oiled barrel of a Winchester rifle with a dark cloth, was Delshay. He wore his heavy canvas duster coat, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his posture coiled with underlying tension. At the sound of her ragged breathing, Delshay stopped. He didn't jump or startle. He simply turned his head, his narrow, piercing black eyes locking onto her frail, trembling form. The silver locket dangled from her bloody fingers. "Help!" Esther whispered, her voice cracking before it completely died in her throat. Her grip on the adobe wall failed. She fell forward into the dirt, her body going entirely limp, just inches from the warmth of his fire. The heavy silence of the ruined mission was broken only by the ferocious whistling of the wind tearing through the canyon outside. Delshay did not move immediately. He sat perfectly still, his Winchester resting across his thighs, his sharp black eyes locked onto the motionless heap of blue fabric and tangled auburn hair lying near the threshold. He had survived 40 years in a world that wanted his kind dead, by strictly adhering to one rule: never invite the trouble of the white man into your camp. Mayor Hiram Croft was a powerful, vicious man, helping the school teacher, the very woman Croft had publicly banished to cover up his own filthy sins, was practically begging for a noose. Delshay had seen the mob in town. He knew the kind of violence men like Croft could buy with a handful of gold coins. When he had refused her the ride earlier that afternoon, it had not been out of cruelty. It was a simple calculation of survival. She was marked for death, and he had no intention of dying with her. Yet, as the biting frost began to settle over the adobe floor, Esther let out a faint, rattling whimper. Her body, completely unconscious, shivered violently against the freezing dirt. Her pale fingers, scraped raw and bleeding, were still curled tightly around the silver locket she had tried to pay him with. Delshay's jaw tightened. He cursed softly in his native tongue, a harsh, guttural sound that carried no heat, only tired resignation. The frontier had taken his wife, his land, and his peace, leaving him with a cynical heart. But it had not turned him into a monster. He could not sit by a warm fire and watch a pregnant woman freeze to death 3 feet away. He set the rifle down against a stone block and stood up, his tall frame moving with a silent, deliberate grace. The heavy canvas duster swished softly against his boots as he crossed the courtyard. He knelt beside her, the scent of alkaline dust and dried blood hitting him immediately. With calloused, gentle hands, he rolled her onto her back. Her face was ashen, her lips a brutal shade of bruised purple split and bleeding from the dry cold. The faded blue dress was soaked with evening frost, the hem torn to shreds, revealing ankles wrapped in nothing but torn, dirty stockings. She was freezing from the inside out. Delshay slid one strong arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her from the dirt. She weighed dangerously little, her frame hollowed out by starvation, save for the heavy protective curve of her abdomen. He carried her away from the broken archway, stepping deeper into the sheltered alcove of the mission, where the adobe walls were thickest and the wind could not reach. He laid her down on his own woven wool bedroll near the fire. The sudden proximity to the heat caused her body to tremble even harder, a violent physical reaction to the shifting temperature. Delshay did not waste time with words she couldn't hear. He unclasped the heavy leather belt of his canvas duster, shrugging off the thick, wind-proof coat. He draped it heavily over her shivering form, tucking the coarse fabric firmly around her shoulders to trap the warmth. Next, he grabbed his weathered tin canteen from a nearby crate. He uncorked it, poured a small amount of water onto a clean scrap of cotton, and carefully dabbed the freezing mud and dried blood away from her cracked lips. The sting of the damp cloth against her raw skin was enough to pierce the veil of her exhaustion. Esther's wide, pale blue eyes snapped open. For a fraction of a second, there was only confusion. Then the memory of the schoolyard, the mayor's hands, and the violent men of the town crashed into her. Panic, sharp and blinding, hijacked her senses. She flinched violently, a choked gasp tearing from her throat. With a sudden burst of desperate energy, Esther scrambled backward, her torn boots scraping against the dirt floor until her back hit the solid adobe wall. Instantly, she pulled her knees up, crossing her arms defensively over her swollen stomach in a tight, protective cocoon. She stared at Delche, her chest heaving, expecting a strike, expecting cruelty, expecting the worst. Delche did not reach for her. He did not raise his voice. He simply rocked back on his heels, putting a safe distance between them. He rested his forearms on his knees, his face a mask of calm, unyielding stone. "You are safe here," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but entirely devoid of the predatory malice she had come to expect from men. Esther's teeth chattered so hard she thought they might crack. She stared at him, recognizing the dark, silver-streaked hair and the sharp, hawkish profile of the wagon driver from town. She looked down and realized she was sitting on his bedroll, wrapped securely in his heavy duster. The residual heat of his body still lingered in the canvas. She swallowed hard, her throat burning. You refused me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. I refused to drive a wagon in broad daylight, where Croft's men could shoot us both," Delche corrected evenly. He picked up the canteen and held it out toward her, keeping his arm steady. "Drink, before your throat swells shut." Esther hesitated. Her eyes darted from the tin canteen to his weathered face. He wasn't smiling. He offered no false comforts, but his hand was rock steady, and the fire he had built was the only thing keeping her and her unborn child alive. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached out from beneath the oversized coat and took the canteen. She brought it to her lips, drinking greedily. The water was cold, but sweet, soothing the agonizing burn in her chest. Delche watched her in silence. When she lowered the canteen, he simply nodded once. He stood up, turning his broad back to her, and walked over to the ruined doorway. He picked up his Winchester, checked the action, and sat down on a stone block directly in the path of the wind. He didn't look back at her as he spoke into the darkness of the canyon. "Sleep. I will watch the trail." Esther sat by the fire, the heavy canvas coat wrapping her in a strange, unprecedented physical safety. She watched the broad, silent silhouette of the Apache guardian blocking the broken doorway. For the first time since Hiram Croft had destroyed her life, the crushing weight in her chest eased. She pulled the duster tighter around her chin, closed her eyes, and let the sheer exhaustion pull her into a dreamless sleep. Dawn broke over the canyon, not with warmth, but with a pale, bruised light that bled across the frost-covered sandstone. Inside the ruined adobe mission, the biting chill of the desert morning crept through the cracks in the walls. Esther Mercer woke slowly, her body aching with a profound, leaden stiffness. She lay perfectly still for a moment, listening. The ferocious howling of the night wind had died down to a low, steady moan. Beneath her cheek, the woven wool of the bedroll scratched against her skin, and draped heavily over her shoulders was the thick canvas duster. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint, earthy scent of pine, the scent of the man who had given it to her. She shifted her weight instinctively, placing a protective hand over her abdomen. A sharp, involuntary hiss escaped her lips. The adrenaline of the previous night had completely faded, leaving behind the brutal reality of her physical state. Her joints felt rusted, but it was her feet that brought tears to her eyes. They throbbed with a sickening rhythmic pain. Slowly, she pushed herself up into a sitting position, pulling the heavy duster tightly around her torn blue dress. Delche was already awake. Perhaps he had not slept at all. He crouched by the small fire using a thick iron blade to shave dry kindling from a piece of mesquite wood. His movements were precise, economical, and completely devoid of the restless, nervous energy that characterized the men in town. He wore only his faded cotton shirt, his broad shoulders shifting with quiet strength as he fed the embers. Hearing her stir, he paused. He set the knife down and reached for an iron pot resting on the edge of the firestones. He poured something into a battered tin cup and stood up, walking over to her. "Drink," Delche said, offering the cup. "Pine needle tea, it will warm your blood." Esther took it with trembling hands, careful not to let her fingers brush against his. The tea was bitter and sharp, but as it slid down her raw throat, a spreading warmth bloomed in her chest. She drank it all, clutching the warm tin between her palms. Delche did not return to the fire. His dark, observant eyes dropped to the hem of her skirt. Her leather boots were practically destroyed, the soles flapping loose, the leather cracked and stained with dried red mud. Beneath the torn leather, her stockings were stiff with frozen blood. Without a word, he turned back to the fire, picked up the iron pot of heated water, and grabbed a clean piece of cotton cloth from his pack. He walked back, setting the pot on the dirt floor, and knelt directly at her feet. Panic flared in Esther's chest. The last time a man had cornered her, she had lost everything. She scrambled backward against the adobe wall, her breath hitching. "What are you doing?" Delche froze, his hands hovering inches from her boots. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried a profound, exhausted patience. "Your feet are bleeding. If the frostbite sets deep, they will rot. If they rot, you die. I can do it." Esther whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and profound humiliation. She hated how pathetic she must look, a discarded pregnant woman wearing rags sitting in the dirt. She reached down, trying to pull off the ruined boot, but the tight, swollen curve of her belly restricted her movement, sending a sharp cramp through her side. She gasped, her hands falling away. Delche watched her struggle, his jaw tightening slightly. "You cannot reach," he said, his voice dropping to a softer, flatter register. "Be still." He didn't wait for her permission again, but his movements slowed, telegraphing his intentions so she wouldn't flinch. He reached out and grasped the heel of her right boot. His calloused hands were incredibly strong, yet surprisingly gentle. He pulled a small hunting knife from his belt and carefully sliced through the knotted, mud-caked laces. He slid the boot off. Esther bit her lip hard to keep from crying out. He repeated the process, with the left setting the ruined footwear aside. Then he dipped the cotton cloth into the warm water and began to wash away the dried blood and desert sand from her battered feet. The sting of the hot water against her raw blisters was excruciating, but Esther gripped the edges of the canvas duster, refusing to make a sound. She was determined to hold on to whatever small shred of dignity she had left. Delche worked in total silence. His touch was strictly clinical, completely devoid of the predatory lingering that Mayor Croft had always subjected her to. For the first time in months, Esther realized she was not being looked at as a piece of property or a problem to be discarded. She was simply a wounded human being. As he reached for a small tin of herbal salve in his pack, Esther noticed something resting on the worn leather of his saddlebag. It was a small wooden horse no larger than her palm. It was intricately carved, the wood polished smooth by years of being held, the mane detailed with tiny, precise strokes. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, she reached out and picked it up. It felt heavy and warm. Delche turned back the tin of salve in his hand. He stopped. His eyes locked onto the wooden toy in her fingers. The air in the ruined mission suddenly grew thick, the quiet tension returning in a heartbeat. Esther realized her mistake. She had touched something personal of a man who guarded his privacy like a fortress. I'm sorry, she stammered hurriedly, setting the carving back onto the saddlebag. I shouldn't have. It's just very beautiful. Delche stared at the wooden horse for a long, heavy moment. He did not yell. He did not snatch it away. He simply dipped his fingers into the salve and returned to her feet, working the bitter-smelling ointment into her cracked skin. I carved it a long time ago, he said, his voice barely louder than the wind outside. For the child my wife did not live to bear. Esther's breath caught in her throat. The raw, unadorned grief in his statement hit her like a physical blow. She looked down at the broad-shouldered Apache warrior, seeing past the intimidating duster and the weapons. He was a man hollowed out by loss, just as she had been hollowed out by betrayal. Instinctively, Esther rested her hand over her own unborn child. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Delche did not look up. He finished bandaging her feet with clean strips of linen, his movements deliberate and absolute. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked out toward the mouth of the canyon, where the rising sun was beginning to cast long, treacherous shadows. "Rest while you can," Delche said, picking up his Winchester. The brief window of vulnerability was closed, replaced by the hardened vigilance of a trail guide. Croft is a coward, but he has money. By midday, his riders will find our tracks in the sand. We cannot stay here. By mid-morning, the brutal dichotomy of the desert revealed itself. The sun beat down on the canyon floor with a blinding white-hot glare, yet the wind howling through the sandstone corridors remained laced with a bitter, biting frost. The air tasted of ancient dust and dry sage. Delche stood near the crumbling outer wall of the mission, perfectly still, his eyes narrowed against the glaring light. He was not looking at the trail directly in front of him, but reading the subtle shifts in the landscape miles away. A flock of canyon wrens suddenly scattered from a patch of scrub brush down in the valley. Then, carried on the shifting wind, came a sound that did not belong in the deep desert. Clack, clack, clack. It was faint, muffled by the distance and the wind, but Delche's ears were trained by a lifetime of survival. Iron horseshoes striking granite. Wild mustangs did not wear iron. He moved silently to a higher vantage point, crouching behind a weathered boulder. Pulling a small brass spyglass from his pack, he focused on the narrow gorge where the trail bottlenecked. A plume of red dust rose into the cold air. 3 riders. They rode heavy grain-fed horses, pushing the animals hard. Through the glass, Delche could see the sunlight glinting off the polished barrels of repeating rifles. They were not passing travelers. Their eyes were sweeping the ground, reading the tracks he had deliberately tried to sweep away in the dark. Croft had not waited. The mayor had sent his hunting dogs. Delche lowered the glass, his jaw tightening into a hard line. The unwritten rules of the frontier were simple. A man survived by walking away from fires he did not start. He could slip out the back of the mission scale, the North Ridge, and vanish into the wilderness like a ghost. Croft's men would find the ruined adobe, find the woman, and do whatever dark work they were paid to do. Delche would live to see another winter. He turned and looked back into the shadowed courtyard. Esther was struggling to stand. She had wrapped the heavy canvas duster tightly around her pregnant belly, using the adobe wall for support. Her bandaged feet, wrapped in his clean linen, hovered uncertainly over the rocky dirt. She looked impossibly fragile, a pale, battered woman discarded by a world built by cruel men. Yet as she raised her chin, refusing to let the pain fold her in half, Delche saw a profound, unyielding dignity in her wide hazel eyes. He thought of the silver locket she had offered him. He thought of the wooden horse in his saddlebag, and the deafening silence of the grave that had swallowed his own family. To walk away now would be to join the ranks of the very men he despised. Delche slid down the boulder and strode back into the ruins. "They are coming!" He said, his voice flat, devoid of panic, but carrying the weight of an anvil. 3 riders, heavily armed. They are following our trail from the valley. Esther froze. The faint color that the pine needle tea had brought to her cheeks vanished instantly, leaving her as pale as bone. Her hand flew to her abdomen in a frantic protective gesture. She looked toward the canyon mouth, then back to the Apache tracker. She took a shaky breath, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the rough adobe. "Leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling but surprisingly resolute. Delche paused, his hands mid-air as he reached for his bedroll. He looked at her, his dark brows drawing together. "You didn't ask for this." Esther continued, her chest heaving as she forced the words out. "They only want me. If they find you with me, they will kill you. Take your horse. Go, I will hide in the rocks." It was a lie, and they both knew it. She couldn't walk 100 yards on her damaged feet, let alone hide from experienced trackers. She was offering him his life, accepting her own terrifying fate, rather than dragging a stranger down with her. Delche stared at her. In his world, words were cheap. Men made promises they broke before sundown. But this broken, pregnant schoolteacher was offering him a mercy no one else ever had. He did not argue. He simply bent down, rolled up his wool blankets tightly, and shoved them into his pack. He reached into the bottom of his saddlebag and pulled out a pair of thick-lined winter moccasins made of elk hide. He walked over and dropped them at her feet. "Put these over the bandages," he commanded, picking up the canteen and securing it to his belt. Esther stared at the moccasins, then up at him, bewildered. "Did you not hear me? They will kill you." "They will try," Delche corrected softly. He stepped closer, his imposing frame blocking out the glare of the desert sun, casting her in his protective shadow. "The main trail is dead. We go up. There is a path along the cliff face. Horses cannot navigate it. Men with rifles will struggle. We will climb." Tears of overwhelming relief and sheer terror pricked Esther's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I will slow you down. I am heavy and my feet—" Then we walk slow. Delche interrupted. His tone left absolutely no room for debate. He reached out his rough, calloused hand, gripping her elbow to steady her as she slipped the oversized moccasins over her bandaged feet. "Tie the laces tight. The rock is unforgiving." While she secured the footwear, Delche moved quickly to the fire pit. He kicked dirt over the remaining embers, smothering the smoke, and used a pine branch to scatter the ashes, attempting to obscure how recently the camp had been occupied. A distant, sharp crack echoed through the canyon, a gunshot fired into the air to flush out prey. They were less than a mile away. "Come," Delche said. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, leaving his hands free. He did not look back to see if she would follow. He trusted her instinct to survive. Esther pulled the collar of the heavy canvas duster up around her neck, clutching the silver locket beneath the fabric. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the freezing air, stepped out of the ruins, and followed the silent warrior into the harsh, red heart of the mountain. The cliffside path was not a trail. It was a jagged, weathered scar carved by ancient water into the sheer face of the red sandstone canyon. It was barely wider than a man's shoulders, a treacherous ribbon of loose gravel and crumbling rock that wound upward into the freezing, thin air. To their left was the solid, unyielding rock face. To their right, a sheer drop of 300 feet into a dark, rocky abyss. Esther Mercer pressed her shoulder against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps that tore at her throat. The oversized elk-hide moccasins Delche had given her provided traction, sparing her bandaged feet from the sharpest rocks. but the sheer physical exertion of the climb was brutally tearing her apart. The early stages of pregnancy had already drained her reserves, and now fueled only by adrenaline and a cup of pine needle tea, her body was hitting its absolute limit. She gripped the heavy canvas duster tight across her chest, her other hand instinctively resting on her swollen abdomen to steady the heavy pulling ache in her lower back. Every step required a terrifying amount of focus. One loose stone, one dizzy spell, and the canyon would swallow her whole. Delche moved ahead of her with the silent, fluid grace of a canyon wolf. His boots barely disturbed the gravel. He did not offer empty words of encouragement, nor did he rush her. Instead, he employed a tracker's intense observation. Though his eyes were constantly scanning the ridge above for danger, he attuned his ears to the rhythm of her breathing. Whenever her gasps turned to choked, panicked wheezes, he would simply stop, leaning his Winchester against the rock and waiting in silence until her breathing leveled out. He never made her ask for a rest. He never made her feel like a burden. The sun climbed higher, casting long, blinding shadows across the gorge, but the altitude brought a renewed, vicious cold. As they rounded a sharp switchback, they were suddenly exposed to the main wind corridor of the canyon. A freezing gale, sharp as a razor, slammed into them. Esther cried out faintly as the wind caught the heavy duster, violently pushing her toward the edge of the cliff. Her moccasins slipped on the loose gravel. Panic, cold, and absolute seized her heart. She threw her weight backward, dropping to her knees and pressing her face against the red dirt, terrified that the next gust would sweep her over the precipice. Delche reacted instantly. He did not shout or grab her arm. A sudden pull could throw off her fragile balance. Instead, he stepped backward, moving deliberately to the outside edge of the narrow trail, placing his boots mere inches from the 300-foot drop. He widened his stance, anchoring his heavy frame against the stone, and turned his back to the gale. He became a human wall. His broad shoulders and solid chest completely blocked the freezing wind from striking her. Esther looked up, her hair whipping wildly around her pale face. Delche was standing precariously close to death, just to offer her a pocket of still air. His faded cotton shirt whipped violently in the wind, his dark hair blowing across his stoic, weathered face, but his dark eyes remained entirely focused on the trail ahead. He was risking his own life, not with a boastful speech, but with a quiet, terrifying certainty. "Stay low," he commanded, his voice rumbling over the howling wind. "Keep your hands on the rock. Follow my boots." Trembling, Esther nodded. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, staying directly in his protective shadow as he slowly backed his way up the exposed ridge, taking the brutal punishment of the freezing gale so she wouldn't have to. It took them 20 agonizing minutes to cross the exposed switchback and reach a shallow, sheltered indentation in the cliff wall. Esther collapsed into the alcove, her back sliding down the curved stone until she hit the dirt. Her legs were shaking so violently she could no longer feel her knees. She pulled her knees up, resting her head on her arms, fighting back a wave of dizzying nausea. Delche crouched near the edge of the alcove, his eyes fixed on the trail below. He unhooked the weathered tin canteen from his belt. He uncorked it and turned toward her, holding it out. Esther took it with shaking hands. She brought it to her cracked lips and took a long, desperate swallow. The water was icy and tasted of metal, but it was the most glorious thing she had ever consumed. After 3 swallows, she felt the container grow dangerously light. She stopped, realizing how little was left, and quickly held it back out to him. "Take it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You need it too." Delche looked at the canteen, then at her. His own lips were white and chapped from the relentless wind and the freezing temperature, his face lined with quiet exhaustion. He had carried her, climbed the ridge, and stood in the freezing gale, all without a drop of water. He slowly pushed the canteen back toward her chest. "Finish it." "But..." A child needs water. Delche interrupted, his tone soft, but leaving no room for argument. I have survived on less. Drink Esther. It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it, spoken in his deep, grounded voice, sent a strange, grounding warmth through her shivering frame. Mayor Croft had only ever called her Miss Mercer or Girl. The men in town had called her a disgrace. Delche simply called her by her name. She pressed her lips together, fighting the sudden, overwhelming sting of tears, and drank the last few drops of water. Before she could thank him, a sound echoed up from the canyon floor below. It was faint, distorted by the wind, but unmistakable. The sharp, metallic clatter of a rifle stock striking stone. Delche's head snapped toward the sound, his jaw tightening into granite. The hunters had found the hidden trail. They were on foot, and they were climbing. He stood up, slinging the Winchester over his shoulder, and reached his hand down to her. His palm was rough-scarred from years of breaking horses and surviving a brutal world, but it was perfectly steady. "Well, we must climb higher," he said. Esther looked at his offered hand. The fear of the men below was suffocating, but as she placed her small, trembling fingers into his large, calloused grip, she realized something profound. For the first time since she had been cast out into the cold, she actually believed she was going to survive. The bruised purple sky bled rapidly into pitch black, and with the darkness came the freezing fog. It rolled up from the canyon floor like a living, suffocating entity, a thick wall of white mist that coated the red sandstone in a slick, treacherous layer of ice crystals. The temperature plummeted so fast it felt like a physical blow to the chest. Navigation became impossible. To take another step on the narrow cliffside path in the blinding, icy fog was suicide. Delche paused, his hand grazing the freezing rock face, until he found what he was looking for, a narrow fissure in the canyon wall that opened into a shallow, dry alcove. It was barely large enough for two people, but it was sheltered from the direct path of the freezing gale. "In here," he whispered, his breath pluming in thick, white clouds. He guided Esther into the dark recess. Esther collapsed against the back wall, her knees pulling up to her chest. She was shaking so violently that her teeth clicked together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. The heavy canvas duster had protected her from the wind, but the biting frost in the air was now seeping into her bones. Her body was desperately trying to protect the child in her womb, pulling all the heat from her extremities. She could no longer feel her fingers or her bandaged feet. Delche stood at the mouth of the alcove, his head tilted as he listened to the canyon. The fog distorted sound, but he knew Croft's hunters had stopped climbing. They were waiting out the storm, camped somewhere on the ridge below. Can you build a fire?" Esther asked, her voice hitching painfully on every syllable. Delche turned to her, his silhouette barely visible in the gloom. "No. The fog traps light. A fire would act as a beacon. They would shoot us where we sit." Esther squeezed her eyes shut. The terrifying reality washed over her. She had survived the humiliation in town, the brutal trek across the desert, and the climb up the mountain, only to freeze to death in a dark hole. A tear slipped down her cheek, instantly turning icy in the bitter air. "I'm so cold, Delche. I can't stop shaking." Delche didn't answer with words. He unrolled his heavy woven wool blanket, laying it across the rocky floor of the alcove to block the cold seeping up from the stone. Then he moved beside her. "Come here," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding rumble. Esther hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The primal instinct to survive overrode whatever lingering fear she had of men. She shifted onto the wool blanket. Delche sat beside her, his back resting against the cold stone, and pulled her firmly against his chest. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, and absolutely no predatory intent in his movement. It was a pure, calculated act of survival. He wrapped his arms around her trembling shoulders, pulling the oversized canvas duster entirely around both of them, creating a sealed, insulated cocoon. He tucked her head beneath his chin, his broad, solid body shielding her completely from the open mouth of the cave. Esther gasped at the sudden contact. Beneath his faded cotton shirt, Delche radiated a deep, furnace-like heat. He was a man carved from hardship, his chest hard and unyielding, but as he held her, it was the safest place she had ever been. She curled her legs up, pressing her back flush against him, and buried her freezing hands against her chest. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent tremors racking her body began to subside. The shared body heat trapped beneath the canvas duster created a pocket of life-saving warmth. Esther closed her eyes, focusing on the slow, incredibly steady thumping of his heart against her shoulder blades. It was a rhythm of absolute endurance. As her hands began to thaw, her frozen fingers uncurled. A small metallic clink sounded softly in the quiet darkness. The silver locket slipped from her numb grasp, resting on the wool blanket between them. Delche shifted slightly his chin, brushing the top of her auburn hair. He looked down at the dull gleam of the silver. "You offered me that for your life?" He murmured, the vibration of his voice rumbling deep in his chest. "It must hold great value." Esther stared at the locket. The emotional walls she had built to survive the last few months finally cracked under the weight of his quiet protection. "It has no money in it," she whispered, her voice raw with unshed tears. "Just a picture. My mother. She died when I was 14. My father followed a year later. I had no uncles, no brothers, no one." She swallowed hard, the painful truth spilling out into the freezing night. "A woman with no family on the frontier is not seen as a person, Delche. She is seen as property, an opportunity. Mayor Croft knew I had no one to write to, no one to come looking for me if I went missing. He knew I was entirely alone. That is why he chose me." A single sob finally broke free, a wretched sound of profound isolation. "And when he was done, he threw me away. I thought if I just worked hard, if I was a good teacher, I could build a safe life. But the world doesn't care if you are good. It only cares if you are protected." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the whisper of the freezing fog outside the cave. Then Delche's arm tightened around her. His rough, calloused hand moved over hers, gently covering her trembling fingers and the silver locket. "The world is a brutal place." Esther Delche said, his voice steady, grounding her in the darkness. "I watched my people lose everything because they trusted the words of greedy men. I learned that the only truth in this life is what a man does not what he says." He rested his jaw against the top of her head, his grip on her hand firm and unwavering. "Croft saw you as a victim because you were alone. But you walked into the desert. You climbed this mountain. You carry a child through the freezing fog. You are not a victim. You are a survivor." Esther's breath hitched. She turned her head slightly, her cheek resting against his chest. "And you are not alone anymore," Delche added quietly into the dark. "Sleep. Let them search the fog. I have the door." Surrounded by the scent of old leather and the unshakable warmth of the Apache protector, the last of Esther's terrifying isolation melted away. She closed her eyes, finally letting go of her fear, and slept safely in the arms of the man who had refused the world, but had opened his door to her. The morning sun crested the canyon rim, a blinding sliver of gold that burned away the freezing fog and exposed the brutal reality of the sheer drop below. Inside the shallow alcove, the air was still painfully cold, but the lethal bite of the night had passed. Esther Mercer woke to the sharp metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked back. She opened her eyes, instantly alert. The heavy canvas duster was still wrapped securely around her, but Delche was no longer beside her. He was crouched at the edge of the alcove, his broad back rigid, the barrel of his Winchester resting steadily on a natural groove in the sandstone. His dark eyes were fixed on the narrow, winding path they had climbed the day before. Esther held her breath, listening. Over the faint whistle of the morning wind, she heard it the crunch of heavy leather boots on loose gravel. A pebble dislodged, bouncing down the sheer cliff face and echoing into the abyss. They had been found. I'd stay against the back wall. Delche commanded his voice, a low, lethal whisper. He didn't look at her, his entire focus funneled down the barrel of his rifle. Do not stand up. Do not look out. Esther pressed herself flat against the cold adobe and stone, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms protectively over her swollen belly. A voice echoed up from the switchback, harsh and arrogant. End of the line, tracker, hand over the mayor's whore, and we might just let you walk away with your scalp. Delche's jaw tightened. He did not waste his breath on a reply. His finger tightened on the trigger. The first shot didn't come from Delche. One of the hunters, impatient and eager for blood, blindly fired a heavy-caliber revolver around the bend. The bullet struck the stone above the alcove, showering Delche and Esther in sharp, stinging fragments of red rock and dust. Before the echo of the gunshot could fade, Delche pivoted out of cover. His movements were fluid, devoid of panic. He sighted the source of the smoke and fired. The Winchester roared, a deafening crack that shook the air. A man screamed, a brief, sharp sound, abruptly cut off by the sickening thud of a body tumbling over the cliff's edge. One down, Delche muttered, jacking another round into the chamber with a smooth, practiced motion. But the remaining two hunters were seasoned killers. Realizing the narrow path was a death trap, they separated. While one laid down a suppressing fire that chewed away the edge of the alcove, forcing Delche to keep his head down, the second man began scaling the jagged rock face above them to flank their position. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burnt cordite and pulverized stone. Esther squeezed her eyes shut, coughing as the red dust filled her lungs. Suddenly a shadow fell over the alcove opening from above. Delche looked up just as the flanking hunter leveled a rifle over the rock ledge. Delche threw himself backward, swinging his Winchester up, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The hunter fired. The bullet tore through the upper left sleeve of Delche's faded cotton shirt, grazing the dense muscle of his shoulder. The impact spun the large Apache around, slamming him hard against the canyon wall. His Winchester slipped from his grasp, clattering to the dusty floor just out of reach. Esther gasped, her eyes flying open. Delche was down, blood rapidly blooming across his sleeve, his teeth gritted in a silent snarl of pain as he reached for the hunting knife at his belt. The hunter dropped down from the ledge, landing heavily in the mouth of the alcove. He was a massive man with a scarred face, grinning maliciously as he aimed his revolver directly at Delche's chest. Not so tough without the rifle, are you, savage? He pulled the hammer back. Time seemed to freeze. In that fractured second, Esther saw the man who had carried her, shielded her from the freezing gale, and offered her his only warmth about to die simply because he had refused to look away from her suffering. The terrified, broken schoolteacher vanished. A fierce, primal instinct erupted in her blood. She was not going to let him die for her. Esther lunged forward from the shadows. She didn't have a weapon, but her hands closed around the heavy, water-filled tin canteen Delche had left near her boots. With a ragged scream of pure defiance, she swung it with every ounce of strength her exhausted body possessed. The heavy tin canteen struck the hunter squarely in the side of the head, just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The blow wasn't lethal, but it was entirely unexpected. The heavy metal cracked against his temple, snapping his head to the side. His shot went wild, the bullet sparking harmlessly against the stone wall inches from Delche's head. The massive man stumbled off